You're so kind to invite me, and thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So welcome everyone to IRSOC and PiMedia's first joint event for this year. One of the most pressing issues in IR is freedom of the press. Indeed, a free press is the light that paves the way to accountability, but that light is not felt by all. Those journalists who nevertheless embark on their journey in paving the way for others to follow suit face the risk of paying for their pursuit of the truth with their safety, security, and even their freedoms or their lives. This will be one of the many topics we will discuss with today's speaker, a BBC journalist who covers the latest and most pressing issues in foreign affairs, tech, and global business. He is reported from Russia, China, and various countries in the Middle East, and contributes often to the Irish Times, The Guardian, and Prospect. And he's also chair of the Westminster Strategic Studies Group. It is a great honor for us to introduce and welcome our speaker for tonight's event, Mr. Pádraig Belton.
Hi everyone. Brilliant, you're very kind to invite me. Thanks. Thank you so much. I studied around the corner here. I did a master's at SOAS, so I'm sort of am also an alumnus within the University of London family. So
you're one of us then.
Absolutely.
So we wanted to start off asking you, what was the impetus behind your interest in journalism and foreign affairs in particular?
Yeah, what's something? I guess it's something you keep asking, right? Because you make a decision to get into a career, and you make a decision to continue in it.
Stay in it.
Yeah. So it is. It's the kind of question you find yourself posing every day to yourself, and I love my job. I really do. I'm terribly lucky, and I can honestly say that. And I know not everyone is so lucky to be able to say that, particularly living as we do in a downturn, where many people have to make compromises, and that's part of life. But I've been tremendously fortunate that I have, and hopefully also some of you, maybe one side of the room more than the other, also have the privilege to write words that often literally millions of people will read, which is a privilege that journalism provides, that other things, academia, consultancy, you're writing to smaller audiences, but you get to really write for the broadest possible ones in journalism. You get to hold the powerful to account, I think is part of how we've always viewed journalism, and maybe particularly after maybe in the US Watergate, the idea that left to their own devices, political checks and balances weren't always enough, and the press is the fourth estate. The press is very necessary, to holding politicians to account, to holding other holders of power to account. It might be people like Elon Musk. It might be other CEOs. It might be celebrities. But there has to be a way of holding power to account. That's something quite important in our commitments to checks and balances after the Enlightenment. So the press is a very important part of that. I think doing it as a day-to-day thing, journalism provides the opportunity to talk every day to extremely interesting people doing interesting things, who know interesting things. No two days are the same. You might find yourself, doing a story on green technology, reducing carbon emissions and things like concrete. And so one day you're ringing these incredibly clever people who spent their entire lives learning, making knowledge very deep in one area, and then you get to ask about that. And then the next day you're doing a story on something completely different. Maybe a foreign affairs story, maybe something on AI.
It keeps the excitement going.
It does, because it is one of those jobs where
you feel part of the world in a way.
I think so. Yeah.
So was there like a specific moment you realized, I want to be a journalist, or was it can you pinpoint an exact moment, or was it more like a personal journey that you found yourself on?
It was a little bit. I was beginning my doctorate at Oxford
Okay.
in politics. So, politics half the room. And we started a blog. A few friends of mine started a blog, and they invited me to come along. We very inventively called it Ox Blog, because it was a blog
At
in
Oxford.
You didn't have to be inventive, the internet was new. And that was fun. Blogs were new, So I covered the Democratic National Convention in Boston that year, where Senator Kerry was chosen as the U.S. Democratic nominee, and I was accredited as a blogger. And this was new, and I spent more time giving interviews about what it was to be a blogger than actually doing any blogging, which was very embarrassing, actually. There's only so many hours in the day. So I found myself, being quite attracted to the number of readers I found myself getting. We were sort of getting, in the neighbourhood of 100,000 or so readers a month, which seemed big in those days. Because this was 1,000 years ago, and that's the inflation hadn't happened yet, and the internet was also smaller, and maybe it was before, I don't know, but quite so much politicization had happened. You did feel that the left and right on the internet were still talking to each other. Maybe still aiming for a measure of truth. It's not too naive, but you weren't only talking to echo chambers quite as much. So I loved that, and then out of that, I found myself doing the odd piece. So if Paris had Battery riots, I decided to go over and started writing blog posts about it. And then I think Prospect gave me the opportunity to write an article based on the blogging I'd done. And so I started very accidentally doing what was, in effect, journalism to procrastinate my doctorate, actually. And I was quite seduced by the idea of writing things in a shorter time frame that were more of the moment for maybe bigger audiences, instant audiences. And I quite liked that. And then around the same time, I met, I was in a bookshop in Dublin. I'm Irish. And I met a girl who was also in the bookshop. We reached the same book, sort of a meet cute. And we ended up going out and getting married and having children. But this is the very start of all of this. She was very incredulously saying, so, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm sort of finishing a doctorate, and I've kind of been doing some articles for The Guardian, The Prospect, The New Statesman. And she said, well, you're sending invoices for all these, right? And I said, well, if I send invoices, they won't like me. They won't commission me anymore. And she says, well, that's absolutely idiotic. You've got to. So she said, all right, you've got to start making a spreadsheet and put all of your articles in there, and then make sure once a week you go and you send invoices. So I said, okay, well, but they're not going to like me. So I sent a bunch of invoices over Christmas in London, came to Dublin, had turkey, came back to London, and there were checks. That just shows you how long ago this was. Checks in the post. And I said, okay, well, maybe you can make a living doing this. And then I was kind of hooked. And then that was me away. And then one thing leads to another. You get slightly better at it. You add to the number of places you write for, the number of editors you write for, and then very accidentally you find yourself a journalist. I mean, I suppose it's the kind of thing that you're a journalist because you do journalism. Doing journalism is what makes you a journalist. It's not having a press card. It's not having a journalism degree. It's purely the fact that you are engaged in gathering news.
It's on the ground.
Stories. Yeah.
Yeah, and just diving into more the topic of on-the-ground reporting, we can say you had a bit of an unconventional start to your career. You started off as a war correspondent in 2014 in Ukraine, and I wanted to ask, how was it like being thrust in such a high-risk situation, covering a major conflict on the ground so early on in your career?
I like to think I'm still so young. Maybe this particular room isn't helping with that very much. But I was in a lecture hall, not so unlike this one in Fleet Street, which is where journalism used to happen in London. You know, there was quite a lot of newspapers. There's still St. Bride's Fleet Street. I think the last newspaper to decamp. I don't know. There was a news agency based there, but basically journalism has departed from Fleet Street. But I was, you know, there's still some relics, some institutions that do things around journalism. So I was in St. Bride Fleet Street, and John Simpson was speaking, and I said, well, you know, you had it so easy, John. You know, starting out, you just had to sit in your CV, and this was a day where there were quite a lot of trainee schemes, quite a lot of jobs for trainee journalists, and bear in mind there still are. I don't mean to make the situation sound quite so dire, but you know, you, John, what would you do if you were just starting out again? You know, and he said, well, you know, I would go and get a flight to Kiev, because that was the end of my Don. So, you know, there's wonderful protests in Kiev against the Russian aligned government, and people had sort of camped out, and it was quite pleasant. You know, there were theatre, there's live theatre happening. You know, there's lots of cultural manifestation around protest. You know, it was lovely. So he said, yeah, right, we'll go to Kiev, because, you know, you go there quite cheaply at the moment, no one wants to go. And just start filing stories. So I said, well, I'll show him, you know, show what he knows, so I'll just do it, just to show him. And so I went and started, you know, filing pieces, and those were my first stories for the BBC. And then elections happened, and I thought, well, I'll go out to the east, to Donetsk. And purely as it happened, I was there when, in Lenin Square, there's lots of Lenin squares along the former Soviet Union. Anyone here from the former Soviet Union? Have you got anybody? Not in this particular room. Okay, so you can, I've got a friend called Diana, and she was driving across the former Soviet Union a few years ago. She's also a journalist based in New York. And, you know, her thing was she'd have a selfie with a different statue of Lenin every day. And her, you know, I think her mother would ask her, so how's Lenin today? And she'd say, well, you know, I found a new one.
Almost a collection of...
Exactly. So, you know, it was in front of the statue of Lenin in Donetsk that the People's Republic of Donetsk was declared. And I happened to be there at the time. I translated, I thought it was absolutely hilarious. It's shambolic. You know, we've got a selfie with the proclamation of the DNR behind us. And you know, we thought it was completely risible. It wasn't going to last. And then it turned out there was rather more behind it, more support from across the border. And then in 2 weeks, I found myself writing stories about all of the cool places in Donetsk closing down. You know, the closing down night of this lovely indie music venue. You know, where they all decided to. The owner just said, "Oh, we're going to go to Kiev and just lock the place up and leave." You know, and you felt it. It felt kind of like, you know, the lights shuttering in Vienna in 1937. Not that I was there. I'm old, but not that old. You know, and so I did quite a few stories about that, about the how people responded to suddenly finding they were living in a Russian proxy-controlled province when they hadn't expected to be. Around the same time, after a couple of weeks and months of this, my press card from the separatists ran out. So I went to wrote them an email. I said, "Hi, you know, I'm a journalist. You kind of gave me a press card. I think it's run out. Can I pop in, renew it? By the way, if there's a chance of interview with any of you guys, I'd love to hear how the world looks from your perspective. You know, what's new." And this is, you know, when I really realised they had got quite sophisticated, or someone in the operation got quite sophisticated, because clearly I was hanging around in Donetsk writing stories for the Irish Times, the BBC, the Guardian, doing what I thought was good journalism and talking to both sides,
Yeah.
you know, in a conflict. But from the perspective of Russia talking to both sides was not good journalism. You know, that was not what they wanted. So they burned me in quite a nuanced way. Was that I woke up one morning and they had leaked that particular email to kind of the most virulently nationalist corners of the Maidan movement, the people who are providing the security to Maidan, and said, well, look at this guy, he's clearly a spy for the Russians. He's writing saying, can I come in? I hope you are well. Not a spy, I'm just sort of British. But, you know, so that became quite loud, and all of a sudden I found out that, you know, there were very humor-filled threats, death threats about my baby daughter. You know, look at how many people of our children have suffered. Wouldn't it be awful if something happened to yours? Kind of thing. And then quite quickly I got a phone call from like my two-up, my boss's boss, which only happens when you're in trouble. And the conversation basically starts, you've come to my attention, what did you do wrong? I said, I was doing journalism. And, you know, I kind of explain the situation. To which she said, right, well, I'm sure it was your fault. But, you know, don't respond, don't get drawn into conversations online, try to get killed. And by the way, here's a phone number in the embassy if you or anyone else from the BBC or any other UK citizens you find yourself in imminent danger. By the way, it's not the number for the police. Fine, so that happened. And around the same time, I found that, you know, there's this package I've been working on, talking to Maidan people and talking to separatists and kind of telling the story of what had been happening in Ukraine from both sides. And I was quite happy with it. You know, I thought it was, it's a nuanced story. Talk to the life stories of people within the boundaries of Ukraine who have had very different lives, and find similarities. Like actually, some of the people who were separatists were saying things like, "Well, we actually supported Maidan quite a lot." It's just that we then thought that it was a very Western-facing movement. We felt, as Easterners, not terribly included in the vision of Ukraine identity that was being promulgated, which I thought was a more subtle kind of nuance to it. It wasn't maybe coming across. But you know, I'd come to Broadcasting House and people said, well, suddenly, as a moment, everyone as one said Ukraine fatigue. You know, that we're not interested in Ukraine peace anymore. We're on to Vince Cable doing Strictly. So all of a sudden, I found myself doing tech stories instead, because anyway, friendly robots seemed all of a sudden quite pleasing if I was getting death threats from my nearest and dearest, and which to me I think was helpful because I learned two things at the same time. First, how nuanced the Russians had suddenly become when it came to the weaponization of information, and also how quickly we in this country, in Western and other liberal democracies, can be to take our eye off the ball. And that doesn't mean sources of threat and danger go away. It just means we're suddenly thinking about Vince Cable doing Strictly.
So just to pick up on that note, obviously, you know, we've seen sort of Russia's crackdown on journalists really come to the fore, I think, in 2014, and we've seen that concern obviously going on through up until now with, you know, arrest and murder of journalists. I guess to what extent would you say that's or could it even be a part of the sort of larger informational warfare that Russia has sort of waged throughout its conflicts with Ukraine and even possibly with its rivalry with Washington?
Yeah, I think it's a story that takes a new tilt around 2014, 2015. So you've got Russia seizing Crimea, which the international community has not recognized. And as a result, lots of US and other sanctions were placed on Russia. Russia sort of responded by going cyber, you know, and you see enormous numbers of bots suddenly appearing, amplifying those sources of discord in the West. You know, maybe both sides of a contentious argument, and bot networks that were quite quickly appearing, and you know, and sometimes even kind of working on Moscow or St. Petersburg time. You know, it was in the beginning it wasn't necessarily that sophisticated, but you noticed, and the reason why was partly that the internet had broken the model of Western journalism as we had then known it, as going back probably to the last years of the 19th century. So you know, if you zoom out slightly and take a longer view of this question, I think you necessarily wanted. You've got early newspapers in the US, maybe separating Pulitzer, the publisher, from Pulitzer, the prize. You know, Pulitzer, the prize represents everything that we quite like about accurate journalism. And Pulitzer, the person, was actually a very shady tabloid kind of circulation chasing figure. In 1898, a handful of US papers raced to declare, one louder than the other, that the USS Maine in Cuba had been sunk by the Spanish. It was actually no such thing. You know, there was the case was poured over. I think relatively recently by a retired U.S. naval admiral who found out that there was absolutely no reason at all to think that the source of the explosion that sank the vessel was from outside of it. You know, it was probably inside. It was ammunition kind of going bang, and the ship goes down. But that didn't matter, because you could sell stories, you could sell newspapers by saying, remember this, remember the Maine. And then you had things like there was a sun-moon hoax, where a handful of stories came out about this village had been found on the moon by a new, incredibly talented astronomer with a very strong new telescope, and all the kinds of animals that were living on this. And you know, stay tuned tomorrow to find out even more about what these moon villagers are up to. And you know, eventually you kind of had all of journalism sort of going into repute, because people had to put their hands up and say, look, there's no people on the moon. It was all kind of a hoax. So from there, you started having newspapers under constant title try to boost their circulations by claims to providing accurate news. This was new. It wasn't just sensational news; it was accurate news, and you could hold us to it because we've got the brand. You know, we're the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune. You know, and instead of sensationalist sort of made-up stories, instead looking for the infinite human drama in news supply in courtrooms or police houses, you know, around the country. You could tell those sorts of stories, tell them accurately, and people would want to buy your newspaper. This is completely new. So this is the transition from Pulitzer, the publisher, to Pulitzer the prize. It went on, basically through maybe you could view Watergate as sort of the heyday of traditional paper-based newspapers with big investigative budgets. You could send people like Woodward, and, you know, out to do 12 stories in a row, you know, delving into something, and be as likely, you know, to have people doing investigative journalism that wouldn't, you know, that wouldn't result in pieces. But there was the budget for that. You know, you could devote the purse hours to doing large investigative pieces. And then the internet comes, essentially breaks that model, as we all know. Partly because from a reviewer perspective, you can get more recent news online, or cable television, moving pictures, you know, it's a more satisfying experience than print-based. Dead Tree journalism. From the perspective of an advertiser, you can hone in on and get more data about where your advertising budget is going. You can direct adverts, cookies. Your advertising buys can be much more targeted. So the advertising budget went towards online media. And then you began to see the traditional journalism as we had known it began to die, which is a process that's still continuing. And into this stepped Russia. So you've got traditional journalism aiming to provide reasonably impartial, credible coverage, and that model suddenly economically being broken. And into this steps Russia, with a very well-resourced state-based media apparatus. Places like Russia today with budgets of 5.2 billion a year, numbers of that magnitude, when what then remained of it, Russia's independent publishing, independent journalism was tiny and cash-strapped. And so you had this very well-resourced body of news able to push out a very consistent message, that Russia and its client states would not do anything wrong, that threats came from the very nasty, villainous West, perfidious Albion, and etc. And punching out stories so frequently along those lines that even smaller, not state-affiliated news houses there'd be a seeping over of those stories beyond Russia today, because no one else had the cash to do actual journalism. So into this you've got Russia around the time of Crimea, instead of responding to sanctions, instead of going cyber, and doing quite well out of it. And you've got reasonably good research about the number of bot networks that are active in the first Trump presidential election, in the Brexit vote. This was something that Russia did quite well. You can create bot networks and use, if people are beginning to get more of their news from Twitter, from social media, and if even, I hate the phrase, if legacy media is increasingly looking to social media as a way of connecting with readers, see it. When half this room looks for jobs in the press, you will see loads about social media correspondence and adverts asking for people who know social media, social search engine optimization, so even if you're somewhere quite venerable like The Economist, we're looking for people to go and put your stories out there on Twitter, because that's where a particularly younger audience will look for its news. So that's a space that's also very weaponized quite easily by Russia. So that's where we are in the story about 2015. Now, you go a little bit later, and actually there's a bit of the rebels strike back. But it's not because governments have anything to do with it. It's not because of Washington. It's not because of London. It's because of big tech. Because it's no longer in the interests of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Well, Facebook and Instagram both being Meta, but it's not in the interests of tech platforms to be seen as providing a venue for hate speech, for being the place where the 6th January insurgency in Washington was organized. You no longer, this is bad for you if you're someone like Zuckerberg, because it means you can't get as much money from advertisers, more investors, and also you're likely to face lawsuits and regulatory action in a number of venues, whether US, UK, EU, they were all looking at regulatory action against tech platforms for the last year or two. So, big incentive for big tech to start behaving more like we were used to newspapers behaving. In providing some sort of metric for the believability of content that was appearing, fact-checking kinds of things. So suddenly, it started to look like things were tilting away from countries like Russia that might want to weaponize social media and back towards the internet being a new place where you might find credible journalism. And then we've got what we're watching now. Twitter is the beating heart of journalism, skipping a beat. Elon Musk paying $46 billion to break the thing and bringing Trump back. And generally speaking, the beginning of a downturn has exposed tech equities as being a bubble, as being toppy in valuations, which everyone knew, but it was the toppiest bit of a toppy economy. It was going to be the first to pop. So in the most recent results, we've seen every big tech firm announce Twitter first, but then Meta afterwards, and others in like time announcing that they're trimming their staffs quite brutally, and this meaning they probably won't have the capability to go and police their content in the way before. And for Elon Musk, this is not a bug, but this is a feature, because less moderated content is for him a good thing. It fits with his notions of being a free speech absolutist, which you may think are sincerely held, you may think are naive, you may think are both. Just put my own cards on the table. But that likely tilts the pendulum back the other way. So a less intensely moderated world of tech platforms is maybe one that presents a sunnier picture for the likes of Putin losing a ground war and needing increasingly to find other battle spaces like information where he can shore up his credibility at home. So it's a very long answer, I swear. So went back to the 19th century.
So just to sort of add on that, obviously we've seen Russia start to exploit information spaces in the sort of global south as well in more recent years. So obviously there's sort of, I guess, different things at play here. Firstly with sort of the US and with Europe, and now as well with the sort of global south. So I guess sort of a two-part question here.
Yeah.
Firstly, in light of what we've seen obviously in recent months with Twitter and with other platforms sort of rolling back on what they've done before in terms of cracking down on Russian propaganda, how do you think that will affect Russia's ability to be able to exploit these information spaces now again, opening up, we can say, in the US and in Europe? And then second part to be with the sort of global south, how does this dynamics also change in light of what we've seen right now in recent months with Twitter and so forth, and their sort of change in their stance on this particular issue?
Yeah. Well, if you're Russia and you don't really have, at least kind of within the last year or two, after the West or the big tech side sort of starts winning or doing slightly better in the information battle, and you've lost influence, you've lost markets in the US and Europe, well, you do though have a number of countries that have historically and often extremely good reasons to be skeptical of the West. So for Russia, that's an intuitive audience. It might be a second best one, but you begin to see bot networks reorientating. So no longer talking about Brexit or Trump, but instead amplifying stories about hypocrisy in the West, and Europe, the EU caring quite a lot suddenly about Ukraine, but not about Syria, not about Yemen, not about the Palestinian territories. So this idea of whataboutery, that Western concern for Ukraine is somehow impure or not correctly held, because look at all these other places where the West its moral righteousness has not been engaged, and is it only because Ukrainians are whiter? That was ultimately what the argument is. So therefore, how can you trust the US and Europe? That's basically the argument, and then bot networks have been intensifying it, and it's worked to an extent. I mean, but you also there are a number of countries in the global south that have opportunities out of Russia's fall, Russia's estrangement of Russia from Western energy markets. So, if you're Nigeria, for example, suddenly the fact that you isn't buying oil from Russia looks quite good. If you're Nigeria in a downturn, but a single resource country still, maybe oughtn't to be, but but unfortunately are. You can sell that one resource to new markets to a greater extent. So not necessarily every country in the global south, which is of course a very big variegated space that maybe shouldn't be put into one category, have the same economic incentives to fall handily and nicely into the Russian camp. But so instead it's an area of contestation rather than an easy win for Moscow. Maybe think of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. Countries like India. So that's where I think we began to see the information battle space move and shift, and there's quite a bit of research on bot networks. A number of new Twitter accounts appearing, the percentage of tweets that come quite quickly. The most active, I think. 50% of the most active Trump accounts and about a third of Trump supporting tweets. Researchers there from bot networks. So these are reorientated, trying to amplify these new sorts of whataboutery messages. So it's something that we've seen in Russia looking to the global south as an area of contestation, which in a way, brings us back to something quite familiar from the Cold War. That you had reasonably homogeneous blocs in the Western Alliance, the Eastern Alliance, and then the post-colonial global south being where both sides would then try to get one over each other. You couldn't go to blows directly, but you could go to blows indirectly in Vietnam. So I think that's what we're seeing now, except in the information domain. And then where it heads, I think partly it depends on things like the West keeping its nerve and priorities in terms of cyber operations, government resources given to taking down, to identifying and taking down these sorts of malicious attempts, and also big tech having the resources. And I don't think either is necessarily going to be a terribly sunny case, sadly.
So obviously the sort of picture here is quite bleak.
It's a shame this isn't vodka.
And obviously with these companies really sort of not having unlike states, they're not really accountable to the sort of wider mass, right? So I guess the question here is, in light of these constraints, what really can be done to sort of, I guess, strike back against these sort of problem, and in sort of and to sort of again strike back in the information space.
Yeah, I mean there are Chrome browser plugins that allow you to engage fact-checking communities in your own browsing. Something you can do, something you can promote online. It's in a way, if big tech is sort of shrinking, there is maybe hope in the GitHub repositories of the world, the open source movements. This is the kind of thing that idealistic software devs and coders, maybe the battle shifts to them and away from the bigger tech companies. I think it is a reasonably sad picture if you look at maybe the government's ability to maintain focus, on sources of threat like this. If you look, I think within the Foreign Office in the UK there's a quartet of Russianists who were really of world class around about early 2000s, and in the wake of 9/11, all government priorities went towards the Arab world, suddenly which turns out to have been a massive distraction. That was not, the great new Cold War, the great struggle of our age. It was a diversion. But it did mean that countries like the US and the UK lost their best Russianists because it was seen as quite old-fashioned to have that kind of incredibly dense human knowledge that you'd acquired over an entire career of postings, of language training. And so these sorts of people left government because they were no longer the flavour of the month. You can't really replace that. So, suddenly governments have lost these areas of expertise. And I think you also see, especially maybe more in the US, this end of the national security consensus that some things, some functions were above politics. Republicans and Democrats could agree, in foreign affairs, at least. The politics stops at the water's edge was always the US refrain. And this is clearly no longer been the case, where you had a President Trump who, maybe not accidentally, had never once criticised President Putin during his entire 4 years in office or since. You had very lax leaking of documents into the public domain that identified security professionals who'd spent their entire lives, whose ability to work depended on their identities being not in the public domain. And suddenly this was something that the Trump administration was doing, and also that UK tabloids, the Daily Mail, outed the identity of UK professionals who beforehand, there would have been something newspapers wouldn't have done. That especially maybe once upon a time, the centre-right would have seen itself as bound by patriotism and nationalism and these sorts of ideas, not attacking the country's resources and capabilities and staff in foreign affairs, and siding with our friend in the Kremlin. So I'm sorry, but it's almost like I'm coming here to depress you, but I don't. That really wasn't my intent. It's far too lovely an evening and group for that. But where's the good news in all of this? I think if Twitter dies, if the one thing that we know is that news always resurfaces. What's the whack-a-mole game? You can push down news gathering in paper print. You can push it down in Twitter, but it will always appear somewhere. There will be new platforms. It won't necessarily be Mastodon, but there will be places where good journalism will appear, and if it does appear, it will bring audiences. If it brings audiences, then it will attract cash and advertisers and investors, and you begin to see signs of new models. And I think we're in a time of transition, but the new models will appear, and I think we just have to look for them. That's more optimistic, isn't it?
So we've talked a lot about this transition, going from print to digital, all of this. How do you think it has evolved in this last 10 decades, but especially where do you see it going in the future? Where do you see journalism going? Is it gonna just stay like dichotomized between print and digital? Do you think it's going to be just digital? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that tree is. We know the writing on the wall as far as that goes, but I think. So, along with the ongoing decline of newspapers, which is stunning, I think you saw, if you're talking about the last decade,
Yeah.
from 2000, between 2019 and 2022, the US saw on average 2 newspapers close every week, which does add up. You then have, I think, about 70 million people living in news deserts that are not served by any particular news patch. And then, if part of what journalism does is it brings truth to power, holds power to account. You know, I mean, so these sound like very grandiose phrases, but ultimately it means having someone from a local newspaper who's employed by selling ads, probably, or subscriptions, but generally ads, to go and sit in council meetings, sit in magistrates' courts, you know, and dig a little bit and look where, you know, suddenly care homes in West Sussex or Kent, you know, begin providing awful levels of service that eventually are caught up by the CQC, by the regulator. You know, but in the meantime, you know, journalists could be out there finding this and not just waiting on something terrible to happen. You know. So the decline of local news, I think, has been a big trend in the last decade. You know, if you going from 2004 to 2022, there's been a 57% decline in newsroom staff in the US. So, you know, the number of people doing news day to day has dropped by more than half. You know. And most of that's in the local end. So local news. You know, we saw it quite you know, have a last hurrah with the local BBCs holding probing the capabilities of the new last Prime Minister, and in the end revealing that she was quite efficient, you know, and her day of finally confronting the local BBCs showed, you know, that eventually, that ultimately her position was untenable. You know, that was local news stepping up to the mark, and now there's, you know, all. I do think the licensed fee will see the back of, has seen the back of jobs, and will probably see the through to the next general election, you know, and probably the cycle of a new party in government. So, you know, there's that. We've talked about the role of social media, I think, as increasing space for news, increasing space maybe for professional news as well. I think something that we have seen in the last decade that we haven't seen before were attacks on the MSN, as we've all now seen it described, the mainstream media, from political extremes on both sides, but predominantly at the moment from the right. So, you know, and suddenly nothing can be trusted if it is from the news. So it isn't that the news is holding the truth to power. The news is somehow perpetuating the narratives of power of a terribly nasty world elite. They're trying to pull one over your eyes. That's the populist view that came out of Trump, that has been propagated as well by, you know, by the criminals touring a diamond mine in Siberia, as you do, and making, you know, chatting with people working there, and someone said, you know, how are you? Where do you come from? And I said, well, I'm a journalist, UK, write for the BBC mostly, And he said, fake news, you know. But not even because, you know, he was trying to be unfriendly. It was just that was so ingrained now as a response that, you know, you're from a Western news organisation, fake news. You know. Clearly, anything you're writing is misleading and wrong, and not where we had once thought of it as the opposite. So these are all things that I think we're seeing in the last decade. The ongoing decline of newspapers, the rising role of social media, attacks on the MSM, decline of local news, and most recently, Twitter is the beating heart of journalists. Where does that go? So it's all changed.
So I guess it's quite daunting for some young people here that want to join the industry to go into. Do you have any advice?
Persist. No, I do. I have a couple. I was thinking about this on sorry, I wrote them down. I stole this.
Give some hope to the new generation.
I stole from my 3-year-old on the way here. So, you know, but before we get to his artwork, I'd say. One advice, if I haven't put you off it completely, is to persist. You know? I can remember starting to pitch pieces in a lovely Brazilian restaurant in Oxford that would let you plug in and have free Wi-Fi. Clearly it was going to last. But pitching 100 pieces, 100 editors a day, around the same time, a friend of mine who's now a columnist in the Irish Times, was starting out, end of her PhD, and she was ringing 4 times a week to kind of follow up on her idea for a column. In the end, it went down to 3 times and twice, and then she found out she had a column permanently. So it's persistence. I think it's applying for every single job going. It's pitching 5 stories to every editor you can find every week, every day, if you can, and then bound back and do it again. And because the first editor to take a piece from of these 5 ideas, new ideas, you keep throwing at them every day, possibly will become a regular commissioner for you, and then you're 1 foot in the door, and then you can keep on going and find your second one, and you keep doing this and repeating, and you have recurring commissioners, recurring places to write for, and quite soon you find yourself you're actually a journalist, quite by accident. That's one. 2 is keep writing. I think we said this before, my strong idea that doing journalism is what makes you a journalist, not the press card, not a degree. So whether student magazines, neighbourhood newspapers, anything to build up your clips, just keep writing. Then when you're pitching your 5 stories at an editor, you can say, by the way, I've written loads for, what's the UCL student name? Pi. Right here. I've written loads for Pi. Here are my clips, here's a couple of my recent stories. And here are my ideas. And it shows your commitment. Keep doing that. 3rd piece of advice, get paid. Don't think that editors won't like you because you want to do it professionally. This is literally what they're getting paid, and you yourself have to be able to earn a living through this. So the NUJ, the National Union of Journalists, have a rate for the job page, which is extremely handy as a resource. You can look at national newspapers or regional newspapers, magazines, and there'll be examples, not just what people think you should be paying, but it's a rolling survey, and this is what they are paying people this week. So you know what to ask for, and if they don't offer it for you, to come back and say, well, this resource suggests this is the going rate. Is that okay? And you have something. You have this, and journalism is populated by journalists who generally are not out. You will often be surprised by the number of people who will attempt to pay you fairly, because they are in this game as well. So, 4th, network. I think it's a vulgar phrase, but you're out doing it tonight. Most of my new work comes from BBC alumni or people I've worked in particular projects with, and and suddenly one of them is running a small magazine, has a bit of a budget, looking to commission a few pieces. This is how work appears. It's kind of by putting yourself out there. It's by knowing other journalists. So that's. Can I have others? Try and get inside the news cycle. You're thinking of your pitches. So don't necessarily think because someone else has done a story, that story's done. Can't write on that. Likely, once one person's done a story, every other news outlet is going to want to do a very similar story because look, it's clearly news. So come and pitch that. Maybe think of something slightly different that you can do. Something that blew my mind when I learned how to put together a book proposal. Slightly different side of the game, but it's something you find yourself doing. I've written a few short books. Not the size matters. And one thing is you're meant to say, what other books have been written about this? And you'd think the right answer is, no, I'm the first person to have this clever idea of writing a book about this. And it turns out that's not right. You're the first person to want to write a witch and wizardry book for children. You're going to get 100 rejection letters. If you're the second through 1,000th, you're going to find it a very easy road. So, that when you're looking to pitch a book, it's actually very handy to show there's an audience, a proven audience for this book, and then you will be aiming at a similar audience, similar with stories. So if something is in a news cycle, try to get within it, try to find out someone new to talk to, some new development. Write around and introduce yourself to editors. Just say hi. I'm a student, write for PI, or part of the International Relations Society. Looking to get into journalism, finalist, wherever you are in your career. Done some work for student journalism. Would you be open to taking some pitches? And if so, what kind of stuff would you be interested in? People will often write back. Look for graduate training schemes. Look for paid work experiences. Mm-hmm. It's a good way to get within an organisation and then be able to find new roles as an insider. So the BBC have very good and paid training schemes that are advertised on BBC Careers. There's a handful of maybe 4 or 5. The FT has one, Reuters has one. The Economist frequently hire new staff. Usually what you have to do there is write a piece. So you'll write me a 1,000-word article that you think could feature in this week's Economist. And you do that. And that's how they hire. So keep doing that. Keep applying for everything. And it's persistence that eventually pays off. So that's my 2 bits of advice.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
So with that in mind, we would like to thank Mr. Pádraig Belton. And of course, you have quite a busy schedule, so we would like to thank you for giving us your time today.
That's kind. I really enjoyed it. I mean, do you guys have any questions? I don't have to go right away. I have to go eventually because someone's cooking me dinner. Yeah.
Yes, when you were referring to, for example, new social media spaces, when you were talking about alternative media, I mean, Donald Trump himself started the new, if I'm correct, by the name Truth Social.
Yeah.
Can we see maybe from, let's say, today's actors in media roles becoming something a bit different in a parallel? If you see, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So will we see, instead of one Twitter space that everyone participates in, will we see?
Are we going to duplicate?
Will we see a number of smaller ones? We haven't so far. I mean, and there have been a couple of attempts. I mean, it was the UK MP who tried to have his own social media space he could join. It was a bit of a source of ridicule. It hasn't happened yet. I mean, we haven't seen Trump's ambitions to create a right-wing media empire really pay off. Not necessarily because there isn't a right-wing space in America that would be there as a market, but maybe it's just its own limitations, you know, as an entrepreneur in trying to seize it. So someone else might be able to do it. I think highly local journalism. I think I was just talking before I came over here with a couple of people. One guy had found something where you can find, you know, kind of like local old school bulletin boards, but very local, you know. So he was in Battersea and he'd kind of pick up a bit of news from Fulham or, you know, Chelsea. And you'd get this extremely hyper-local content. And he was saying, well, could this be something that we will see start to take the place of local content? You know, if you have these news deserts, are there ways of making everything? So maybe the differentiated space not being ideological, but being hyper-local, trying to get your story that has to do with Russell Square. You know, like I say, you know, watch the space. I see different things. I'm not sure what will take off. There's probably a slightly more fraught market in trying to attract seed capital, venture capital investors at the moment because of the tech sell-off. So models that do not rely on seed funding, VC funding early on will be rewarded. You know, models that maybe get advertisers or subscribers even in quite early, but they'll be the ones that have a leg up.
Hi, quick question.
Please.
I'm sure if you're keeping up with the Qatar news coverage right now, and my question is, do you think the way the UK or even the European journalists approach covering news in the Middle East can be improved? Because there's a lot of clashes in fiction right now with regards to how journalists are being, you know, treated when they arrive to cover the World Cup, for example.
Yeah, I think so hugely. What do you think? What's your
Well, I just feel that 30-second clips on Twitter can invite a lot of instant moral judgment, and I feel that maybe there is a different way where we can sort of trade and have a better communication with local authorities. I'm not really sure with what happens behind the scenes, behind getting a press card or something, but I think the recent clip of, was it a Dutch or someone from the Netherlands or a European country, a journalist from a European country was trying to cover the news, and then the cut, some policemen came by, and then there's a bit of a scuffle, and I was just wondering if there were actually proper processes behind that, what led to that kind of situation, and whether foreign news journalists can approach the region, the Middle East and North Africa with a better attitude in general, so that there won't be this kind of distrust and suspicion. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, one response that I've got is a slightly different direction. So if you're talking about maybe the journalism of the 30-second, very emotive clip, so maybe where one wonders, what is the future of long form? What's the future of... So if you look at, keep coming back to politics, if you look at the sorts of stories that win Pulitzers, they tend to be series. They tend to have a combination of deep reporting of individual stories and maybe some data journalism, you know, applying different methodologies to a complex story, and maybe doing that in a series of 6 or 7 articles. They are not any longer the provenance of the New York Times or the Washington Post. You know, they're increasingly might be freelancers, might be someone writing for for somewhere quite local. You know? So there's a rewarded future to long form. I think the question is how it's going to be paid for, and where it will live. And I think if you're looking for a sort of journalism that will maybe balance out the emotive 30-second video clip, you know, with looking at the very nuanced picture from reporting of individual stories, for looking at data in different ways, a couple of methodologies, that will live somewhere. The question is where will we look for it? Because when we find a place for it, it will attract readers, and once you attract readers, you attract advertisers, and you start to have a model. Who else? Yeah, please.
So you've obviously written for a lot of different journals and newspapers like you talked about, and I was wondering, have you ever felt constricted or limited in kind of what you want to write? Obviously, like you said, there needs to be an audience for kind of the topics that you're writing on, but have you ever noticed kind of, I don't know, a pattern for a certain topic that's just kind of been constricted, and have you seen a difference between the different kind of newspapers that you've written for?
Yeah. There's a particular way that the BBC approach stories I actually quite like, which is that there are these Reithian principles. There's an early Director General called Reith, funny enough. He thought that, that the BBC's job should be to inform, educate, and entertain. These are quite nice principles. Wherever you do journalism, this is something you can maybe live by. So maybe a tech piece, for example, will, if it's to live happily in the BBC, it's to be something your grandmother can read, on the assumption that your grandmother is not an associate professor of computer science at Stanford University, which some grandmothers are. But this particular grandmother is a professor of something else. So you'll lure in readers with an interesting case study or interesting problem, and then you'll talk them through something you'll explain things well, but in the end you'll get to something reasonably cutting edge, reasonably state of the art, reasonably techy. You've just explained it well, you haven't used jargon. And maybe even got to the point where you're looking at where the cleverest people in the world, what at the moment is keeping them up, and what are the different challenges they're trying to overcome, and in what ways. And if you could do that in 800 words, take your grandmother who's not a computer scientist but does literature, through to understand reducing carbon emissions in concrete manufacturing, say, and then how it's done, what the recent developments are, what's hard now, how people are trying to overcome what's hard. And I think that fulfills the Reithian objectives quite well. So that's a sort of story that fits well in somewhere like the BBC that may not fit well in concrete times where you're writing for people who are more specific. It's more of a trade journal. So that's not ideological, that's substantive. Where I think gets close to what you've asked is I used to write quite a lot for The Spectator, which centre-right publication, but it always, for me, felt like the kind of place you could write anything. It didn't have to be centre-right. You could just write it. It was what you thought was correct. And that way, it always felt like that until Brexit. And then I noticed that everything on Brexit, or anything touching on Downing Street, anything touching on Theresa May or Boris, was being edited by Fraser Nelson, by the editor-in-chief, going to his desk. So it was a longer process of getting your stories approved, and anything too critical of the wisdom of a great glorious Brexit was likely to be taken away from your article. And in the end, I stopped writing for them altogether. This had been a lovely space where you could say things that did not have to be centre-right at all. You could, it was there as a marketplace of ideas, and that I noticed that became quite constrained. I don't necessarily think I haven't found that in other papers. I haven't found constraints on what I could say. Sometimes Americans don't like to use British expressions. So you find yourself saying things in print that you would never actually say because it hurts American ears too much. That's the only thing. And then this complete digression. I found one of my books popped up on audiobooks. A friend of mine one Sunday said, let's play your audiobook. And I had very zealously not done this because like I have a voice and I knew this was going to be. I love Kansas, but they just got someone from there with the most kind of flat Kansan voice you can imagine to sort of to read this thing that I would have been quite happy to record for, which they never asked. So it was I was begging my mate to turn it off. So that's a very literal instance of your voice being changed slightly in the process of transmission and translation. But generally speaking, I found most good editors, most good publications will allow you to report the story as you found it. They won't interfere for political reasons, which is good. It means there's hope.
So with that, we'll take one more question if anyone has any other questions.
Yeah.
Just briefly, where do you look for pitch ideas? Or how do you find pitch ideas?
So, it's from being out there, from going to, if it's tech, it's going to tech conferences, it's talking to startup people who I like. You know, a reason why I like writing about tech is you have people out there who are living the dream. You know, they could be having these easy lives in investment banks, living in Canary Wharf, and instead they decided to quit that and, you know, cobble together new tech and put together, be founders in their garages, you know, bootstrapping it and trying to get funders. It's brilliant. I mean, it's a wonderful story. Anyone who does it is special and mad and deserves praise. And I've noticed that often their former colleagues from Morgan Stanley will not want to talk to them because they've gone off the other side, question all of the rules they live by. So yeah, getting around and talking to people, whether it's doing what it is that you're covering, if it's tech, talking to tech founders, or coders, devs, if it's if it's a work correspondentry, going out and talking to people who live there, which you can increasingly do by Zoom. You can do a bit of, if you can't access a geography in person, you can often find a way to talk to them. Less so in Kherson. That was a problem in covering the Russian withdrawal from Kherson because the power was cut, telecommunications were cut, so you couldn't quite get through to people there. But often you can. So just talk to as many people as possible, and ideas come out of that. Looking at other stories to give you ideas. This is something. Read your favorite newspaper. I subscribe to the FT. Read it on the tube or the treadmill or the exercise bike. And if something is neat, there's probably another story to be written on it. It's not that you're knocking off the first story. It's that your reporting builds on that. So those are the kinds of things. New books coming out. Yeah, there's always new books appearing to review, which is a source of authors who are out there who are happy to be quoted, maybe be interviewed. That's a source of stories. Because often, people who write books are often interesting, public, and if their book is out, they're probably keen to sell it. So they might be keener to talk to give you an interview than otherwise. And then you sort of meet it halfway. Not necessarily to say fake it until you make it, but you approach them, you say, I'm a journalist, I'd love to interview you. And then you go back to your commissioning editor and say, I've been discussing, interviewing this person with a book out. And then you can kind of slowly seal the deal from both sides. Just a couple of ideas.
So with that in mind, we would like to thank Mr. Pádraig Belton.